Hey everyone, welcome back. In the last video, we covered the foundational concepts related to the payment processing. So we know who the real actors are and how they interact with each other. Now's the time to get the hands dirty. So in this video, we will learn how to integrate a payment gateway in a Spring Boot application. So we will build a simple checkout page and then we will implement the payment processing part in a Spring Boot application. So let's get started. Let's understand the prerequisites. What do we need in order to implement a payment gateway in a Spring Boot application or in any application? So the first thing is that you need a payment gateway account. This is the first thing and the most important thing in the payment processing. You need a payment gateway account. When we create the payment gateway account, we will get some kind of keys to access the payment gateway APIs and SDKs. The second thing is we also need test cards to simulate different payment scenarios like valid credit card or expired credit card or a credit card with insufficient balance. So this is something that we would need in order to test all the payment scenarios. And the third and the last thing is you need a Spring Boot demo application in which you will integrate the payment gateway. So in this demo for the payment gateway, I am going to use Stripe Gateway, which provides a test mode or a sandbox, and it also provides test cards that we can use during the development to test different scenarios. Why Stripe Gateway? Because they have a pretty simple process. You just create the account and you get the test mode by default. You don't have to provide any documents or you don't have to go through the KYC. It's just a simple account that you can create, and as soon as it's ready, you get the test mode or the sandbox so you can get started with your code. So that is why in this demo we will use Stripe Gateway. So let me give you a quick walkthrough of Stripe Gateway. Where do you find the documents? Where do you find the dashboard, and how do you find the keys that we need to use in the code? So in order to use the Stripe Gateway, just do a simple Google search and it will take you here. So if you click on this one, it will take you to the documentation page. Now Stripe has a very good documentation covering different scenarios. So any scenario that you want to develop using Stripe, you will find the information here. And on the same page on the top right, you will find the link to create an account. I already have the account. Once you create the account, it will redirect you to the dashboard. Let me show you the dashboard. So this is how your Stripe dashboard would look like. The first thing that you would notice is this warning that says you are using test data to accept payments, complete your business profile. What that means is by default, you get a sandbox, a test container that you can use to develop application to play with Stripe Gateway. It does not make any real payment. In order to accept the real payments, you need to complete the business profile that will take the process of KYC, accepting some documents like ID documentation and all. So you don't need to provide that. We just need the test sandbox. So you will see as you develop the program, as you do the dummy payments, the balance would get updated. So this is me playing with the Stripe Gateway using my code. That is why this number. The other thing is you can see that I'm using Payment Gateway 101. This is my sandbox. You can create different sandboxes for different purposes. All right. The important thing is here where you see the API key. So there are two keys, publishable key and the secret key. Secret key is something that you would use in your application to interact with the payment gateway. Publishable key is something that your client, your UI client can use in the code in order to interact with your backend application. Since this is the publishable key, so this can be used, let's say on the HTML page that will be shown up in the source code, that is perfectly fine. But since this is a secret key, this must be used in the backend application that will interact with the payment gateway. So make sure you create the account and you copy the publishable and the secret key because we will use both the keys in the application. All right. So once we have the account, the next step is to create the Spring Boot application. We will go to the Spring Initializer, and this is going to be a very simple application because we are not going to build the whole front end. For this one, we will create a simple checkout page using JS and HTML. Okay, no complete front end, only the checkout page. And then we will make a call to the backend application as per the scenario, and the backend application will talk to the payment gateway. And as you will see, the checkout page can also talk to the payment gateway page. Okay, so we will see all those things as we go on. So here is a very simple Spring Boot project. You can see all the basic details, and I have only added two dependencies, Spring Web and Lombok. Lombok is optional. Spring Web is something that we need because this is going to be a web application. Generate the project and configure it. So I have already done it. The other thing that I have done, instead of hard coding the secret keys and the publishable key in the application itself, I have added them as VM argument. You can also do that. You can go to the run configuration, edit the configuration configuration and add the VM arguments to pass both the keys. If we do that, we don't have to hard code the key, let's say in the application.yml or properties file. So that is just one way to secure your keys. So the basic setup is done. What do we do next? So the good thing is all the heavy lifting is done by Stripe or the payment gateway that you are using. So as you will see in a second that you don't need to develop the complete checkout page accepting the credit card information. This will all be populated by the SDK that we will use because it's already done. The good thing about this one is since you do not control that part, so you do not touch the user's payment information, which is very sensitive. So if things are happening between your client and the payment gateway, if you're not touching the customer's information, the credit card information, then you do not own the security aspect. Of course, you need to make everything secure from your application perspective, but from the compliance perspective, your application is not touching the user's credit card information. So let's start with the checkout page. That is the first thing that we will add in this application. And by checkout page, I mean that ideally what would happen, we would have a UI, a front-end application showing the elements, the items, then the user would select the items that he wants to purchase. Then we will show a cart page and maybe a checkout page. Now we are skipping all this. For this demo, we are focusing on a simple checkout page, which will be an HTML showing that this is something that the user is going to buy. Because ultimately from this demo perspective, what we need is the item that the user wants to buy and the amount, and then we want to make or implement the payment thing. All right, so that is why we are skipping the whole UI part. So we will create a dummy checkout page just to show you what code must be done in order to trigger the payment and how it's done. Okay, so let me add that checkout page. So we will use the same code base, same application, and under resources, under static, we will add a simple HTML for the checkout page. So let me do that. So I have the HTML ready. I will simply copy paste it. And this is the checkout.html page. And the first thing that you would notice that we are using this script, which is coming from js.stripe.com. So this is the script that we are injecting in this HTML. So you will see how things happen when we run the application, because most of the things will be taken care of by the Stripe itself. Then this is style, nothing related to the payment. Then we are creating an HTML form. You can see the ID and you can see a div and a comment that Stripe will inject the card fields here. So when we run the application, so you can notice we are not creating all those text boxes to accept the credit card information. This will be done by the Stripe itself. Okay, and then you can see we have a button that pay $10.99. Okay, so this is just a dummy account because this is a dummy checkout page. Ideally, what would happen when the user selects the items, it goes to the checkout page and the amount will be calculated based on the items that he has selected. But this is a simple checkout page where we know that this is the amount that we need to pay. Then we have a div, a section for showing the result. Okay, now this is the script part which is important, and you can see here we are passing a key. Now this key is the publishable key that can be published on the client, and you can copy paste this code. All we are doing that we are passing, or we are telling Stripe script that this is the element that you have, where you have to inject the payment fields. And when the user hits the payment button, when it clicks the payment button, we will make a call to the backend application to the /payment endpoint that we will develop in a second. And why we do this? Because the client needs a client secret. Okay, and the backend application will provide it a client secret. Without client secret, the client cannot make the payment. So that is why this backend call. And you can see in this backend call, the client is passing the amount and the currency for this order. And in a real application, this payload would change because you would pass a lot of information to the backend depending on what kind of front end do you have or what kind of shopping page that you have. Okay, so once it gets the client secret from the backend application, the next step is to confirm the payment. Okay, so in this case, you can see we are using Stripe API and we are calling confirm card payment. In this case, your UI client is going directly to the Stripe. So the payment is not happening by using backend and the payment gateway. So this is also possible that your client would go directly to the payment gateway. All it needs is a client secret for which it will go to your backend. So here we are passing the client secret and the card element. Now, what is this card element? You can see this is the card element that we created that will tell Stripe that this is the div where you have to inject the payment or the credit card details. Okay. Then we are waiting for the result of this call, and if the result is success, then we show that the payment succeeded. If the result is failure, then we will show the failure status accordingly. So in this case, if you remember from the last video, the concept of authorization and capture, that first there is an hold that is placed on the amount and then the payment is confirmed. But in this case, when we call confirm payment, we are merging both the steps and the client is talking to the payment gateway directly and making or confirming the payment in one go. So that is why I said that it is a two-step process, but it's not always implemented like this. Okay, so once we have the checkout page ready, we need to write a REST controller to accept this call and to return the client secret. That we will do next. So let me add a new controller and we will name it payment controller. Then we would add the post mapping. So we are exposing an endpoint and we are accepting the data coming from the UI using request body using a map. Why map? Because let's keep it simple. We know there are two keys, amount and currency, and the value. So we can simply accept it using a map. Otherwise you would need a Pojo, or there are various ways to do this. Okay. So how do we create the client secret? To create the client secret, we need to use the Stripe gateway. And to do that, we need some code that can talk to Stripe gateway. And to do that, we need the SDKs. Okay. So let's go back to the documentation of Stripe. So you can explore the documentation. To get started, we will go to start developing and set up your development environment. So under Java, the first thing is you need Stripe CLI. Although we haven't done it, I will show you when we do that. When we use the webhooks part, then we will need the Stripe CLI. Okay. But you can install it, you can follow the steps, you can get the Stripe CLI ready. This is very simple. The thing that we are interested right now is this part, okay, where we need the dependency of Stripe that we can use in a Java application. So this is the dependency that we need. Let's copy. We will go to the pom.xml and we'll add this dependency. Once we have this dependency, what we need is something called payment intent. What is payment intent? As the name suggests, this is coming from Stripe. Okay, you will find this information in the documentation. Payment intent represents the intent of a customer that he wants to do a payment. So as soon as you have the information of a product or the amount or the checkout that the user wants to do, you create a payment intent. So that is what we are going to do here. From this information that the client is passing, the amount and the currency, we will have a payment intent. So the first thing is, let's extract the fields that we need for this demo. And the second thing we need is currency. So once we have the data extracted from the client request, how do we create the payment intent? We use the classes from the Stripe payment intent create params. Now you will find all this in the documentation. So builder.build, and then we will configure this payment intent create params. So the first thing is that we have in this demo is the amount. So you can see there are different fields that you can set in order to create a payment intent. You can set up the automatic payment methods if you have configured this. We have not. We can set the currency amount that we have. You can set the confirm, you can set the payment method, amount, capture, all this. So you can configure the payment intent as you want depending on the scenario. So I will suggest go through the documentation, understand how Stripe works so that you understand what do you need depending on a scenario. So let's set up the fields that we have. We have the amount, we have the currency, and that's it. So we now have a payment intent create params, and based on this we will create the payment intent because this is basically following the builder pattern. All right. So this next step is to create the payment intent. Then you call the method paymentintent.create and you pass the params that you have created. And once you have the payment intent, okay, from this payment intent, we get the client secret that the UI client needs. This is just one of the ways to return the response, and in this case, we are returning a map with key client secret and the value the client secret itself. Why? Because if you go to the checkout.html, we see that this is the key that the client needs in order to call confirm card payment. Okay, so now that this part is done, we can run the application. Why? Because in this case, we have a simple checkout.html. All it needs is the client secret that we have already implemented. The actual payment part you can see is being done by this method call, which belongs to the Stripe. So we don't need anything else. Okay. So at this stage, let's run the application. You might notice that we have not done any code to accept the card details or to show the card details UI boxes. This will all be done by Stripe itself because we are using this particular JS. So let's run the application and let's see what is going on in this application. So the service is up. Let's go to the browser and here you will access checkout.html directly because this is under static folder. All right. Now you can notice that there is a section card details, although we did not code for this. This is coming from Stripe, okay? Because we provided a div and we write the JavaScript code. We asked Stripe to inject payment card details under this div, and that is what it is doing. So where do we find the card number? We need the card number to simulate the payment scenarios. Where do we find the card numbers? For that, we'll go back to the documents and we'll go to this section accept a payment, and here we can see there are different ways to actually implement the checkout page. Stripe hosted embedded form, we will see a couple of them later as well, but we are right now interested in the testing part. So we can go to the testing section and here you can find the details that these are the card details. Okay, so these are the test cards that we can use to test different scenarios. So here you can find all the card details. If you use this card, this is to test the success scenario. Okay, if you want to test the authentication flow where the card payment requires authentication, then you would use this card. Okay, if you want to test the scenario where the card is declined due to the insufficient funds, then we will use this card. But what about other details like CVV, CVC or expiry date? So we can find it here. We can enter any future date for card expiry. We can enter any 3-digit number for CVC or also known as CVV. And you can enter any postal code if this is asking for postal code. Okay, so let's go back and we'll test the success scenario. So let's do that. We will pick this card and we will paste it here. And you can see this is now asking for expiry date, CVC, and this is all coming from Stripe. So we can pass any future date, any 3-digit number like this, and we click the payment button. Now there is nothing happening. Let's check why. And we see an exception that no key provided. The reason is, although we generated the key, which is publishable key and the secret key, but we have to do one more step. We need to initialize stripe.api key in order to use the Stripe SDK. So let's do that. That is why this is not able to create payment intent as well as the client secret. So the first thing is we need to read the secret key that we are passing using VM argument. And in my case, the name of that VM argument is Stripe secret key. Then I can initialize stripe.api key in a post construct method. I just need to do this stripe.api key. We need to tell Stripe the secret key. Okay, let's restart the application. So the service is up and we can see the key was initialized. So let's go back to the client and let me insert the details again. So this is the card. And let's hit the payment button. And this time we see payment succeeded. And if we go to the service, we see the logs that payment intent created. So it went to the backend service, it created the payment intent, it got the client secret, then it went directly to Stripe gateway to confirm the payment. And that is why we got the success response that the payment was successful. So that is how we test the payment gateway things using dummy cards, because in this case there is no real money movement. Okay, this is all between the test data and the Stripe gateway. In the same way, you can see how easy it is to test different scenarios. So let's try this one where the card requires authentication. This represents the scenario where the client would have to, or the user would have to authenticate the card payment. And as you will see, we have not done any coding to handle this. It is all handled by the Stripe in this case. So if we use this dummy card, this will show us the payment card authentication thing. So let's go back to the checkout page, and instead of this one, we just need to change the card. And this time, if we try to do the payment, you can see there is an authentication pop-up. And this is again coming from Stripe. And you can see the dummy message. You can test again the fail scenario or the complete scenario. Since we have already tested the payment succeeded part, let's fail this payment. Let's see what happens. So in this case, we get the payment failed response that we are unable to authenticate your payment method. Please choose a different payment method and try again. Okay, so you can see how easy it is to integrate the payment gateway using a simple checkout page and the Stripe APIs. And you can also see that all this is done by the gateway. In this case, your application is not touching the user's card information at all. This is happening between the client, in this case your checkout.html, and the Stripe using their APIs. So this is just one of the ways of developing a simple checkout page. And there are a couple of different ways to do this. So we will try a couple of them as we go on with this video. So for that, if we go back to the accept a payment section, and here it is. So you can see there are different ways for web to create the checkout page. So I suggest go through this documentation, but we will still try this particular piece, which is Stripe hosted page, as our next example. As for the next example, we will pick the sample from the documentation itself under accept a payment. As we were discussing earlier, we will now use Stripe hosted page. So everything that is required to integrate a Stripe hosted page is documented here only. So let's check the details out. We already have the Java dependencies Stripe Java, so we can ignore this one. After that, we have to create this checkout.html page, and we can copy the same code. So we'll go to the IntelliJ and we'll create a checkout.html with the same code. So here in this project, we'll go to the static folder where we had the checkout.html. So this time we'll create a different HTML. We'll create a new file, and you can name it whatever you want. And I'll paste the same code here. And here you can see, in order to handle the checkout button action, we need to create an action. So let's rename it. We can say something like hosted checkout. And that's it. We need this simple HTML. Let's go back to the documentation. So this we have already done. The next step is to handle it on the backend side. And you can see this code is slightly different from what we write in the Spring Boot application, because here it is creating the session, then this is response.redirect, and we will handle it in a slightly different way in the Spring Boot controller. Okay, but this code is good for starter. We can pick this one and then we can modify it according to the Spring Boot application. So let's do it. To handle this, we'll expose a new endpoint, and this will match with the name that we have given in the form action. So let's add a new controller. Okay, which will be hosted checkout, like this. In this case, maybe void, because we will not return anything, we need to redirect it. And in this case, we need access to HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Okay, so going back to the documentation, let me copy this code and we will paste it here. Let's import the missing classes and the session. This will create, or okay, this will throw an exception. So let's add it. And for that, we need to create the session params. This is following the same builder pattern that we have seen with payment intent. Okay. So the mode is setting that we are creating a payment, then we need something called success and cancel URL, so that depending on the outcome of the payment, it can redirect to a success page or to a cancel page. Then you can see that it is setting some properties related to the order, like quantity, the price data. Now this is hard coded in this example, but in a real application, you will get this information somewhere from the client, which is a client application. It could be your UI, it could be Angular or React or anything. And on the backend, you will fill these properties. But in this case, this is hard coded. Okay, so what we need is the success URL and the cancel URL. And in this case, for the demo, we will create simple HTML files to represent the success and the failure scenarios. So let's modify it. In this case, this is localhost 8080, and this will be HTML. Now in the end, you can see here it is calling the response.redirect, and it is redirecting the flow to a URL which is coming from the session. Okay, so how do we do this in the Spring Boot application? Well, there is a way to do this, so let me do that. Once we have this session, we will create a URL, URI.create session.getURL, like this. So we have the location, and then we need to redirect the control. That we can do using response entity dot status. We need to set some status. Dot location. This is the location. Dot build. Okay, so we have the controller ready now. The missing piece is to have the success and the cancel.html pages. So maybe we will find it on the documentation itself, going back to the documentation page. And you can see this is telling you how to test the endpoints that we will do in a second. And if we scroll, you can see the success.html. There is no code for cancel.html. And for now, let's copy the success.html. So we'll go back to the IntelliJ. Under the same static folder, let's add a success.html. And we'll paste the same code. Now this code is ready. If we run the application and if we use hosted.html instead of checkout.html as we were doing earlier, then let's see what kind of differences there will be on the checkout page. So let me start the application now. The service is up. Let's go to the Chrome, and instead of checkout.html, this time we will say hosted.html. So you see there is this checkout button that we added on the HTML page. When we click this, it will go to the controller, it will create the session, and then it will redirect the control to that URL. So let's do that. If we click on the checkout button, you see this will be redirected to Stripe. And based on the details that we have provided, you can see it has automatically generated the checkout page, the payment page. So you see, again, we did not write anything specifically for this checkout or payment page. This is coming from Stripe. And to test it out, we can fill the details. So let's do that. Like this. Again, we can use the same card. Okay. So the payment is successful and it is now redirecting the control to success.html, which says thanks for your order. And similarly, we can test the other cards like to test the insufficient balance or the authentication, which is the additional authentication scenario, everything. So we can basically test everything with the help of the test cards. Okay, so this was the second way to develop the checkout page, which was Stripe hosted page. And in the same way, you can follow the documentation and you can read other stuff related to your use case. And the main point is it is very simple to follow the documentation and to code accordingly, because most of the things are done and handled by the payment gateway in this case. All right. So now that we understand how to develop a checkout page, how to integrate the payment processing, there is one more thing that we will cover in this video, and that is the webhooks. So what is a webhook and what kind of scenarios can we implement using webhooks? So what happens when a payment is created or captured, or a payment is refunded or fails? The thing is, what we have done so far, we were capturing the response on the UI, which is on the HTML in this case. And that response is basically the client's response, your client's application, which is coming from the Stripe in this case. That is fine. But the thing is, we cannot fully trust the client's response. The reason is because browsers can be closed and user might lose the connection, or the flows like 3D Secure, in which the client has to authenticate or provide additional authentication. Some processes are asynchronous, so it might take some time. And that is why we cannot fully trust the response that we see on the client. And in such scenarios, we use a webhook. So a webhook is a piece of code that we write in the code base, and using a webhook, the payment gateway sort of calls your backend directly with the final truth of the transaction, whether the transaction was a success or whether the payment failed. So as we will see in a demo in a second, that we will write some code that will represent the webhook controller. Then after a payment, we will listen for the events which will be published using webhooks by the Stripe gateway, and we will listen to the events and we will know that, okay, if a payment was successful or a payment failed. And depending on the webhook event, we will do some more processing. So for example, after a payment, you will listen to the webhook event. If the payment is success, you might do a DB update, okay, to update the status of the order, that the order is paid. And if the payment fails, you can update the order to be failed or on hold, something like this. So there are various things that we can do by listening to the webhook events depending on the use case that we are implementing. Okay, so in order to write and test the webhook on your local, we need the Stripe CLI, which I mentioned when we started the hands-on. So you can set up the Stripe CLI if you go to the setup your development environment, and under the Java section or anywhere, you will find the section setup Stripe CLI. So you just need to install the CLI, then do the Stripe login. I already have the Stripe CLI. So what I will do, I will say Stripe login. So this will open up an authentication page. Just allow the access. So now you can see I've logged in Stripe CLI. The next step is we need to redirect the webhook events on my local to a particular endpoint so that I can listen to them. To do that, I will run this command. Okay, so it says Stripe listen. You listen to the webhook events and then you forward them to this URL, which is localhost 8080 webhooks/Stripe. And once you run the command, you will see a signing secret, which is this one. So in the same way that we added the VM arguments for publishable and secret key, in the same way I will add another VM argument for my Stripe webhook key. And you can do the same thing or you can handle it differently. The thing is, when we write the code to listen to the webhook events, we need this key. So just copy it and store it somewhere. Okay, let's start writing a webhook controller which will expose this endpoint so that we can listen to the events. Okay, so I will write a new controller and I will name it webhook controller. And for the request mapping, we need to define the same endpoint, which is, then we will add the post mapping, a method. And in this method, we need HTTP servlet request. And we will get a payload. So we need to extract this. Then we will also need to read the header, which is Okay, as for the remaining part, to save some time, I have the code ready. So let me paste it here like this. And you can see we need the header. So this is header and it needs the webhook secret key. So let me fetch it here because I have added it already as a VM argument. So the first thing is the webhook secret key that we got from the terminal, and here we are reading it from the VM argument. After that, in this method, we need the access to the HTTP servlet request. Then we are getting the payload, and then we are getting the header as well. So we are reading the payload and the header from the event, which will be redirected or forwarded to this controller because we ran the command. So we need to understand that this controller will be called whenever there is an event from the payment gateway via webhooks. So when we get a request, an event, we need to reconstruct the event from the payload, from the secret, and using the header. Once we have the event object, we are handling different types of events. So during the lifetime of a payment or a transaction, there are different events which are triggered by the payment gateway. You don't have to listen to all of them. Depending on the use case and scenario, we can pick and choose. So you can see here we are checking the type of the event, and then we are handling only two events, which is PaymentIntent.succeeded and PaymentIntent.paymentFailed. Okay. Apart from this, if there is anything else, we say unhandled event type. Now this will not break anything. This is just FYI to the server logs that there is one event, but we are not handling this. Okay. So in this logic, if the control comes here, this means the payment was success. So what we are doing, we are getting the data from the event, which has the ID of the transaction and the amount or the attributes that we did set. So we can use this metadata to correlate things on our end. All right. So in this case, we are using the metadata just to print some things on the server logs. But additionally, the way to handle this is when you listen to a webhook event, you do some activity in your application. So that is why we have a comment here that in this case, what you would ideally do in a real application, you would probably update your database that, okay, this order is now paid. So we can fulfill this order. We can pass it on to a different service maybe. But if the payment failed, then we are again getting the payload from the event. And in this case, we are printing the ID of the transaction that it failed. And in that case, we will again update the database and maybe we will fail the order. So these things or these scenarios can be handled in a webhook controller. All right. So how do we test it? So I am already running the command which is listening to the webhook events, and we will start the application and we will again do the same payment. So the service is up, and to test it out, we will use the same checkout page that we did earlier. But this time, instead of just waiting for the client's confirmation, we will also listen to the events. So let's go back to the Chrome and we will use the same checkout page. So here we are, it was hosted.html, and we will click on the checkout button, which will redirect us to the checkout page. And let's fill out the details again. And you see the success.html page. But if we check the server logs, we should also see some events in the logs. So here in the service logs, we see additional messages, and you can see there were many other events as well, because during the lifetime of a transaction, there are different events which are triggered, but we are handling only two of them. So you can see since the payment was success, we see this one, payment intent succeeded with the ID of the transaction. And you can see other events as well, like charge succeeded, payment intent created, and charge updated. So all these events can be handled depending on the use case that you are implementing, and they can be very useful in implementing scenarios like reconciliation between your database and what's there on the payment gateway side. So although we are just logging the event, in the real scenario, we will do some more business logic here, like updating the database, updating the order in your database, sending more events to other services. And similarly, to test the other event, which is payment failed, you can use the other test card which was there on the documentation to simulate the failure scenario. Okay, so in that case, what would happen, instead of payment intent succeeded, we will get this event which is payment failed, and we will see payment intent failed. All right. Also, the good thing about Stripe documentation is that you can search different pieces on the documentation. So just for your own practice, what you can do, if you simply search for this webhook event in the documentation, then you can see that there are different ways to do different things, and you can try things from the documentation. So let me show you. If you go back to the documentation, there is this search field, and if I search for this particular event, then you can see there are many hits. So if you go to this one, payment status updates, So you can see this is under this section, payment status updates, and monitor a payment intent with webhooks. That's what we were doing. So you can find the sample here as well. All you would need to do is convert the code as per the Spring Boot if there is any difference between the code that is given here and the things that Spring Boot supports. Okay, and you can see on the right there is an assistant as well, so you can interact with that assistant as well. Let's say if you want to get some information from the docs, so you can find all the details here on the webhook events, how to read them, what kind of events are there. And you can see this is the similar command that we ran to forward the events to my local system, to a particular endpoint. All right, so this is all there in the documentation, and that completes this video. So in this video we just built a working checkout flow with Stripe and Spring Boot. We learned how to create the payment intent on the backend in the Spring Boot application, then how to confirm the payment using Stripe payment gateway and the SDKs, and we also listened to the webhooks to finalize the status. The key takeaway of this video would be that implementing payment gateways in an application as a developer isn't as complex as it looks, because most of the heavy lifting, as we have seen, is done by the payment gateway. All we need to do is we need to use the SDKs appropriately. So that's it for now. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.